What's cracking, guys? Omar Esoff here, back with another video. Here today with a very special guest, Milo Wolf. Milo, what's going on, my man?
I'm good, how are you?
You are the first official guest in the Garage of Gains. How does it feel?
It feels fucking amazing.
Well, it is amazing to have you. I want you to give a proper introduction of yourself because today we're talking about range of motion, a big debate that's been, taking over the internet. In particular, the potential benefits of lengthened partials. But please introduce yourself to the audience.
For sure. So my name is Milo Wolf. I recently finished my PhD on range of motion and its effects on hypertrophy and strength. As you mentioned, one thing that's kind of popped up during my PhD is the effects of potentially lengthened partials on hypertrophy and whether or not it may be superior to full range of motion for hypertrophy.
Right, and now Milo, so this is something people have been talking about for quite some time, and some people have said, due to some of the research coming out, that it might be a gimmick. Just why overcomplicate things? But it seems like the research is becoming increasingly clear of the potential benefits of lengthened partials. That's what this video will be about. In particular, this video will focus on hypertrophy, range of motion in general. What role does range of motion play when it comes to hypertrophy? Like, why are we even talking about this? The idea of either doing full ROM, as people define it, or partial ROM.
So without delving into the details, if you have performance goals, like, you're a powerlifter, you're a weightlifter, even for general sports like team sports, for the most part, the range of motion you use within your lifting should be specific. So it ultimately comes down to the principle of specificity, wherein if you want to get better at a certain range of motion, that's mostly what you train. For hypertrophy, on the other hand, it's a bit more nuanced, right? So traditionally, the thinking was a full range of motion is always best for hypertrophy, and that's kind of what you probably heard until like maybe a year ago, maybe even now. But more recently, there's been a sort of growing body of evidence suggesting that when you're training at longer muscle lengths, for example, using lengthened partials, that may actually be better for hypertrophy than a full range of motion. So far, there's actually no study comparing a lengthened partial to a full range of motion, where a full range of motion resulted in more growth than lengthened partials. So at the very worst, it's like you get the same growth. At the best, you get a bit more growth with lengthened partials.
So Milo, let's go back then to full range of motion, because this has been the assumed kind of truth within the space, and people that do partials, oh, you're just cheating or you're cutting short the range of motion because you don't want to do like the full repetition. What was the thinking regarding doing basically exclusively full range of motion?
One is kind of sometimes a natural bias, naturalistic bias, like a natural fallacy, wherein people think, oh, we can move through a long or full range of motion, so therefore that's what's best because it's natural. That's what we're naturally able to do. Just because something's natural doesn't actually mean it's better for growth, right? Like PEDs, they're not natural. They make you grow more. Another thing is like, one rationale was that a full range of motion takes you through a variety of joint angles, and different joint angles require different areas of your muscle. For example, at the bottom of the squat, you might be training the quad close to the knee, or at the top, you might be training it close to the hip. And so by going through a full range of motion, you're training the full muscle and a variety of muscle groups. In reality, the data we have on regional hypertrophy, or how doing a lengthened partial versus full range of motion impacts growth in different areas, doesn't actually show any difference. So just using lengthened partials, you will still get growth in a variety of areas. So that's not really a concern either. And the final concern is kind of like injury and pain. And I think that's an often misunderstood thing, right? Like there's a lot of misconceptions about pain and injury. We won't get into them, but I think it's way too early to say whether or not like a full range of motion is safer or a partial is safer. It really comes down to the individual as well, like whether they have anything going on already.
Now, Milo, we've been very selective with the phrase we've used. Lengthened partials, not just partial range of motion. What is a lengthened partial? Like, why are we focusing in particular on this?
So a lengthened partial is any sort of partial range of motion where on average, you're training at a longer muscle length. Let's say the squat, right? In the squat, if you're doing a full squat from lockout to ass to grass, the average muscle length being trained for your quads, your glutes, your adductors might be somewhere around parallel, right? That's kind of the average. Now, if you were to take a lengthened partial on a squat, what you do typically is about half the full range of motion. So that would be from ass to grass until about halfway up, or maybe around the sticking point, just above parallel. In this case, you would be shifting the average muscle length being trained to being longer, and that's why it's called a lengthened partial, because it's a longer muscle length and it's a partial range of motion. And essentially, it looks like just doing a partial isn't good enough. Like if you do a partial half squat, essentially, from lockout to like halfway down, that's likely quite a bit worse for growth than a full range of motion. So a full range of motion only seems to be better for growth when it makes you train through longer muscle lengths. And that's kind of where the benefit of lengthened partials comes in, because it allows you to train through even longer muscle lengths.
Can we quantify yet, Milo? So we're talking about this benefit of lengthened partials where you say it is potentially superior in ways to full range of motion, or perhaps incorporating both. And someone might say, okay, but sometimes there's research that shows like a 2% benefit, 3% benefit. is this really something that's important? Can we kind of quantify the potential benefit of incorporating lengthened partials?
If I had to give some rough figures as to how much you'd be missing out on, for example, if you did shortened partials compared to full range of motion, you'd be missing out likely on about 5 or 10%. Likewise, if you're switching from full range of motion to lengthened partials, and this is a bit more tentative, we don't have quite as much evidence directly yet, I'd say you'd be gaining around 5 to 8% again, compared to full range of motion.
Well, let's assume that someone actually wants to start incorporating lengthened partials. How would they go about doing it?
So I think it really depends on how willing you are to experiment, right? If you're willing to go the distance, you could switch most of your movements to lengthened partials. Now, I think the movements and the body parts where you'll notice the most difference is for muscle groups and exercises where generally you fail in a shortened position. You can think of the back, right? Yeah. When you do pull downs, when you do pull-ups, when you do rows, typically you'll fail at very short muscle lengths. So that lengthened position, that lengthened range, isn't getting a ton of work. So by doing lengthened partials in those exercises and for those muscle groups like the biceps, like the back, like the side delts, and that stuff, that's where you'll notice the most effect. So I'd say if you're willing to experiment, try switching maybe half of all of your exercises to lengthened partials and see how you feel. Just keep in mind that for the quads and chest, it might not be as pronounced. And if you're less willing to experiment, you could either just switch some back, biceps, side delt work to lengthened partials, or another option would be to simply do your full range of motion work, but then instead of ending a set when you reach failure or whatever RP you want to train to, you continue going, just doing half reps, for example, in that lengthened position.
For cases like the back, you can use considerably more load. So it makes sense to do kind of maybe full range of motion, then lastly you do it at a lengthened partial. How would you then change those variables? So let's talk about sets, reps, total load. So let's say someone wants to incorporate it. Would their programming be similar to a full range of motion movement?
So I think for sets and RP, etc., you don't need to change a ton, right? Like sets, you may find that your recovery takes a slight hit. So there may be a slightly increased fatigue cost when you train exclusively at lengthened positions. That's not super clear yet. So I would say start at roughly the same volumes, number of sets as you were before, maybe a bit lower, and then adjust from there. We have some evidence saying that below 5 reps, probably not ideal for hypertrophy. And so if by doing lengthened partials, you're kind of increasing or decreasing rep duration and making each set shorter, that minimum threshold for number of reps per set might shift from 5 to say 7 or 8. The load may change depending on the exercise. So for back work, for example, as you mentioned, it is a bit easier, so you can use more load. For hamstrings and quads, for example, if you're doing lengthened partials on squats, because you're essentially not giving yourself a rest, you may actually find that the load you need to use drops a little bit. So it depends on the exercise, you may need to experiment, but at first I'd say start around the same number of sets, maybe increase the number of reps slightly if you're around 5 usually, keep RP the same, and keep tempo and stuff the same. You can also make other slight tweaks, like for example, controlling the eccentric more in the lengthened position, maybe pausing in the lengthened position and being explosive at the bottom of a squat, for example.
Sure.
Because by being explosive, you generate more force at longer muscle lengths. Hopefully, that'll increase the stimulus. But generally, that's what I'd do if I would tell someone, hey, try some lengthened work. It might increase your hypertrophy.
But how do we kind of standardize that so that we know we're making progress instead of just, we're shortening the range of motion more and more every single time? How do we figure out our range of motion for a lengthened partial?
Conceptualizing full range of motion as being 100%. Generally, with a partial range of motion in that lengthened position, we've tested between 1/3 to 2/3 of the full range of motion. So as long as you're somewhere around half rep, I think you're in the clear, right? Like the findings from the research should generalize to you as well. For the pull-up, for example, you may pull until your arms reach about a 90-degree angle or about the bar reaches the top of your head. That can be really standardizable. For a lot of machine work, there's a certain landmark you can pull to. Like a machine row oftentimes is like a setting or the pad or what have you can pull to, and that can be super repeatable and standardizable. For free weight stuff in general, like compounds for upper body and for lower body, typically what I would aim for is a knee or elbow angle of about 90 degrees at the top. And then you go like that. That's a really clean way. And for what it's worth, we actually have done research on repeatability of partial range of motion max testing. So essentially seeing how strong are people on 2 separate days trying to replicate the same range of motion. Do they get the same numbers, right? Because if they don't, that's a sign that, oh, they're not good at standardizing range of motion. And actually, people are pretty consistent. So it is a concern in practice. You think, oh, partial range of motion is difficult to standardize. You think of the ego bro at your gym, like half squatting, and every time you see him squat, it's shallower and shallower, and the weight keeps going up. If you're cautious and you use a similar amount of weight and reps week to week, you'll find your range of motion is actually quite consistent.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting too is that the misconception there is that people would assume when they talk about partials on the squat, as we just said, they're quarter squatting. Well, that's not the lengthened partial. That'd be the opposite range of motion. So they're actually not even doing it. So I think like that conception of like the typical bro doing it just doesn't pan out. Let's talk then, Milo, about some of the misconceptions with length and partials. What have you heard come up? Because you've been talking about this, for publicly on podcasts. We had you on Iron Culture for well over a year. What are some of the common misconceptions you've encountered?
So I think one is that it's more injurious. The people making this claim, I think, don't have really any evidence to rely on. For a lot of things in exercise science, physiotherapy in general, it is mostly a matter of acclimating to it. So I wouldn't recommend you just jump from doing full range of motion only or shortened partials only to doing only length and partials right away. Because the one thing that we might see in injury research is that generally acclimating to stuff gradually or graded exposure is a good thing. But inherently, there's no reason for it to be more injurious, to my knowledge. Another thing is that it's kind of like just ego lifting, right? I would say 10 years ago, people didn't really think about range of motion. Now that the evidence has sort of started to emerge, until a few years ago, the pendulum kind of started to swing towards full range of motion, and I think people started to kind of associate certain moral virtues with full range of motion. It's like, oh, you're moving through a full range of motion, you're putting ego to the side, you're not caring about the weight, you're all about technique. But technique is ultimately a means to an end, and that end being hypertrophy. Yeah. So if length and partials are a better way to get at that end, you should consider it. So I'd say injury and pain, technique is another one, or ego. And then a final one is just that it's a lot more fatiguing inherently. The research around fatigue and training at lower muscle lengths isn't as clear as people think. And a lot of it will be novelty. When you first start training at lower muscle lengths, it's going to be novel. You're going to get some increased soreness. But after a few sessions, just like training to failure for the first time, initially you get quite sore, but it does attenuate over time. Yeah. And so personally in my training, for example, and a lot of my clients' training, I hadn't really experienced any meaningful drop-off in how many sets you can do, for example.
Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk very briefly about your own personal journey, because you're a lifting enthusiast, you're someone that is inclined towards hypertrophy, you want to get those gains. What have you found with yourself since you've incorporated length and partials?
Man, I never want to overstate my own experience. This is N=1 with a shit ton of confounders. However, I will say, personally, I've enjoyed it. My growth, at the very least, hasn't been noticeably worse. Like the back, and maybe this is just sort of confirmation bias, so I don't want to oversell it. But I do feel like my back, for example, has gotten substantially better. And there is also do you know Alberto Nunez?
Yeah.
So he's generally shifted towards more length and training recently as well.
For me right now, I'd say about 80% of what I do focuses on hey, let me find what is the stretch position for this muscle, spending some extra time with the pauses there.
Apparently his back has grown a lot as well. So I do think that for some body parts, in my experience and my clients' experiences, it can potentially help quite a bit, especially if you have stubborn body parts like your back.
Mal, you're very precise, very thorough. This is certainly not the last time we'll be having you on the channel. You crushed that, my man. Where can people find you?
You can find me on Instagram at wolfcoach. That's my last name and coach.
Come on now.
I don't just pick animals,
Yeah, you're the wolf coach.
Exactly, that's me. And you can find my research stuff if you type in ResearchGate Milo Wolf, which is all the range of motion stuff and other cool research on lifting. And finally, my website, Wolf Coaching Open.
Definitely give Milo a follow. One of the new bright faces in the industry, shaking up. I do appreciate you coming on and sharing this research, because all too often when it comes to training in general, there are rarely things that are being re-examined, but this certainly is one of them. So it is very exciting these times. Thank you so much for watching this video. Guys, if you enjoyed this video, make sure to like the damn video, and I'll see all you guys, my rascal, in that next one. Peace.
How long is it?
3.5 inches.
That's it?
It's perfect. Introducing Rascal Classic Bodybuilding Shorts with a 3.5-inch inseam. Not too big, not too small, just right. Now with our limited edition summer colors. Miami white, hot teal, cool coral, and neon pink. Dang! No matter the size, release your thighs.